So it's 7 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name's Janelle Aldred. I'm Deputy Chair of Women in Journalism. Now I know a few more people will be joining us as we go through. So I'm just here to really give an introduction to two extraordinary women who are about to have a fabulous conversation that I, for one, am personally very glad to hear. And I'm sure, like us, you've probably got your feet in paddling pools on ice blocks or face down in ice chips today, as I have been lying in a darkened room. But nothing could drag me away from hearing this conversation. Sam McAlister has been called a booker extraordinaire, and you'll hear more about her story and more about that interview. But the amazing thing that I think Sam has done, which is wonderful for women in journalism, is really put producers right in the spotlight for the massively important job they do, and the understanding that so many people are now having about all the scoops, the name of her book, that wouldn't happen if producers were not able to get some people, high profile people, to say yes to coming onto our programs and spilling the juice. And so that is something that Sam did. And maybe she'll say that's the most defining moment of her career or not, but I'll let her tell you. But she's an amazing, amazing person. And funny story, we'd made friends on Twitter, and I was at a restaurant having lunch with someone else, meant to be. And the person at reception says, "Oh, the lady's over there." And I said, no, because the lady I'm meeting's mixed race and that lady has like long blonde hair. So no, but then I saw the long blonde hair and I saw the really fancy boots and I was like, but actually I do know that lady and I've been dying to meet her. So I went over and said, "It's Janelle from Twitter." Nice and cool. But I was really, really pleased to meet her. And also Sarah, who's an amazing face that we have all seen on Sky News. She's now a freelance journalist, but she's also royal editor, more than that. And so the two of them together, and Sarah met her at Sam's book launch, had a lovely conversation. Two amazing women with two perspectives on the royal family and also their roles. And so this is going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. We're so pleased to have you. Also, thank you for those who bought your tickets. Portion of the money is going to Future Dreams House, and Women in Journalism, we're here to support women at all stages of their journalism career. And I hope you hear a bit more about how women have supported women and been fabulous in their careers through this conversation. So I'm going to take the video off me, get my fan on, and Sarah and Sam, take it away.
Janelle, thank you. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us on this webinar this evening. And a big thank you to Sam. And Sam, if anyone had said to you a year ago that you were going to write a book, and a best-selling book as it is now, that there was going to be a film made of it, and that you would be all across the media yourself, doing interviews on TV, in newspapers, on the radio, what would you have said to them?
I would have thought they were drinking too much, Sarah, or maybe like overcome by heat. I mean, obviously, it's just been an extraordinary ride. This time a year ago, as you say, I was still at the BBC doing my job that I'd been doing for 10 years, which I loved a great deal, but I knew it was time for a change. And I think a lot of us know when that's in the water. And I knew it was in the water for a couple of years. And it was just finding the right way, the right thing to do, the right form of exit. But my goodness, to leave, write a book, never written a book. It was a bit of a tall order, 70,000 words, here you come. And then this film news as well. I mean, it really is a dream come true.
Yeah, I mean, what a few weeks this has been for you, Sam. We want to come on to talk about that Prince Andrew interview in depth in a little while. But first, let's go a bit further back in your story and to how it all started for you, because actually journalism wasn't your first career.
That's right. My first career was in a rather another foolhardy way. Although I'd never met a lawyer, I decided at university that I wanted to become a barrister. It sounded really great to be paid for arguing, and I loved arguing. So it seemed the perfect fit. And so off I went to law school and I trained to be a barrister. I did criminal defense and I practiced for 2 years in and out of cells with alleged, she says tentatively, rapists, paedophiles, murderers, and obviously shoplifters largely. And that was my career as far as I was concerned. That was what I wanted to do, particularly as a woman. I thought that would be something extraordinary to do. And I couldn't believe my luck when I got pupillage and I was working in chambers for a couple of years. But it was not the right fit. And I was frankly miserable. So I had to make the difficult decision to leave the bar, and it was the best decision I ever made.
Yeah, and then what happened, Sam? Having made that decision, how did you break into journalism, to the BBC, and then ultimately to Newsnight?
Well, I did that thing that I think other people do without thinking. I used connections. I hadn't had any many years ago when I first started out. You know, I turned up at law school like really green. And I mean, they must have thought I was hilarious. I didn't know what most of the subjects were, let alone understand them. And I had to do 3 years and 9 months. But obviously over that period, I did start to meet a few people who were a bit more influential, and the students that I was with, lots of them went on to do different things. So I'm literally unemployed. I've walked out of being a barrister. I'm at home on my sofa. I'm using some quite, foul language in my head that I won't use, don't worry. And I'm wondering what the toot, should we use that word? What the toot to do with the rest of my life? So I come up with a practical thing. That's the only thing I had really at my fingertips. Mum and dad couldn't help, but I had friends from university who had interesting jobs. So I approached 3, they were all women. One was in a charity, one was working in academia, and one was working at the BBC, as luck would have it, on a legal programme on Radio 4 called Law in Action. And I went for lunch with 2 of them. And the third one, the one at Radio 4, invited me in to look around for the day, and they took a liking to me.
So you were kind of combining your previous career with a new venture at that point. After Radio 4, you then made the move into television. Tell us how that came about.
When I came back from maternity leave, I expect this is a common tale for a lot of women, and I wanted to go part-time, and I was told, to put it bluntly, that my previous career, where I was effectively a correspondent on More or Less, the wonderful numbers programme now with Tim Harford, which I'd helped start with Andrew Dilnott, and Law in Action, where I'd been a reporter, that let's put it this way, that wasn't available to me anymore as a part-time worker. And so I was put into this weird place that seemed to be full of women, actually, a lot of them who'd had children, called development. And there I languished, missing my time on air and wanting to do something that was more challenging for me because it didn't suit me. And so I saw an opportunity to go to Newsnight for a day. And again, I'd never done news, I'd never done television, and I'd never done a combination of anything live and television and news. So, a bit foolhardy again, deluded. And so I turned up and I did a day there, and I treated it like an 18-hour interview, and I just threw myself in. It was absolutely terrifying, I'm not going to lie. And I started that morning with no experience of television news. And by 6 o'clock that night, I was expected to brief Jeremy Paxman on the Irish economy. I knew enough on the back of a stamp. I mean, it was basically negligent to have me do that, let's be honest, but that's what I had to do. And that was my baptism of fire at Newsnight.
It's very much sink or swim. And I think that will probably resonate with a lot of people listening to this, a lot within the industry. I'm just going to, a quick word, actually, while I'm asking you all the questions at the moment, Sam, we do want to hear from the audience. So if you think of a question while we're talking, put it on the chat. And at the end of this discussion, we will try and get as many of your questions to Sam as we possibly can. So do join in while you're watching. So one day at Newsnight, Sam, how do you manage to turn that then into something more permanent?
Well, as you will have noticed throughout my career, and you know me a little bit better now, Sarah, I don't really take no for an answer in a professional setting. And so I just don't really abide by the rules that everybody else abides by. I didn't really know what they were. I loved it there. And so at the end of the day, I went into the editor's office and I did something quite crass, you might say, but what's the worst that happens? My mum always say, they say no. So what? Better to try. And I said to him, look, I loved working here. This is the best day in my professional life at the BBC. I want to stay. Give me 6 weeks. If I'm rubbish, you'll never hear from me again. And if I'm not rubbish, keep me. And he kind of liked that, lucky. And he gave me 6 weeks. And that was the beginning of my 11 years, I think, at Newsnight.
And Sam, you fairly quickly realised that actually your interests and your skill set meant you wanted to take a slightly different path to a lot of those working on the programme.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that often when you get into a particular newsroom or a particular place, you know how it is. There's a certain force that moves you towards a particular conclusion that's seen as the high status thing, either presenting, which, I had opportunities to do, but wasn't for me because I was part-time, single mum. I didn't want a public profile, or at Newsnight being a filmmaker, a mini Scorsese, making those exquisite films that people really enjoy at the time probably, but often don't remember the day after. But the thing I loved was that magical moment of jeopardy when we got a guest and something went terribly wrong, or, you know, forgive me, they lost their job, or there was some scandal. You know, you think of Newsnight and you think Michael Howard, you think Prince Andrew, right? That's what you're thinking of. Maybe Chloe Smith, if you watch it a lot of the time, those magic live moments, they were the thing that I loved. So although it was actually, I would say, probably the lowest status thing from the public perception, like within the organization, for me, it was the thing I loved. It was the highest status thing for my happiness. And so I pursued that with a visceral passion.
And how do you pursue that with a visceral passion, Sam? I mean, you described the fact you don't take no for an answer. That quality is presumably what's led you to where you are now.
I think you do have to be good with rejection. I sometimes describe it as like going on 1,000 first dates and only getting one second date. You know, you have to have a thick skin, because most of the work I did for many years, you guys have never heard about, because nothing ever came of it. And so I think one of the skills I learned early on was that most of the time I'm going to get a no. I'm very gracious in defeat, at least publicly. Obviously, you go and swear in the toilets or be annoyed about it. But I'd always get into that pattern of, if I failed, asking why, trying again, being polite, just continuing. And in the industry, this new thing of interviews producer, it's a relatively new phenomenon and not really something people understood. In the States, if you say booker, then everyone knows that's very high status. But in this country, it really wasn't so much of a thing. So I just created my tiny little, you know, my tiny kingdom of one, my queendom of one. And I just kind of carried on trying to bring in magical moments of television. And every time I got one, the next time it was easier to persuade people, but easier to persuade my boss that I shouldn't be doing those films that I didn't like doing, or presenting, or going out and reporting, because that's not what I wanted to do.
Well, I was going to ask you, actually, it's not just about persuading people to appear on the programme and do the interview in the first place, is it? You also had to persuade your editors that what you were offering was worth putting on the programme and giving enough time to.
Yes, I have to say that was one of the most bizarre, surreal things of the job. It's kind of like a dual thing. You're trying to persuade an interviewee, often extremely high profile and important in the objective world, but in the subjective BBC world can be hard to persuade them that they are basically the most important thing. You must have them. It's crucial. They are everything. And simultaneously, you're trying to persuade your own team. Imagine someone like Elon Musk. Now it seems insane. Trying to persuade your own team that they should have this person on because they've not heard of them. And so the they've not heard of them syndrome is really pervasive in newsrooms, which often are quite monolithic and not very diverse. So you could have a real challenge on your hands, and anybody who wasn't from a think tank or a world leader or an obvious choice, persuading your own team was often harder than actually persuading the highly important individual to come on the program. And that was very difficult, because I found that very frustrating.
You talk in the book, Sam, about having 2 proper strops and a lot more mini ones. What was it that would really trigger you to lose your cool?
Oh my gosh, I had 2 proper strops. Strop 1 was, picture the scene. Okay, news journalists, bear with me. This is just so traumatic, even all these years later. Dennis Rodman, okay, globally famous sportsman, volatile, television gold already, before I've even finished this sentence. Just back from North Korea. Private audience with the great leader. There are photos, which I have access to. I'll show them to you later, Sarah. No one has seen them. First interview and live in Vatican City. No brainer, right?
Got everything. Yeah.
No, it's got everything. What more does it need? They said no. Now, I have to be honest, I stropped out of the building and threatened to leave. And I had to be talked off the ledge figuratively by a colleague, because it was such a no-brainer to me that I couldn't believe it. Now, on that occasion, I capitulated. Later, there was, just before I left the BBC, a similar incident involving Prince Albert of Monaco. Some of you may have seen that interview because it became one of the biggest hits the BBC had that year. I was told, for boring reasons of miscommunication and other, tiresome things that most jobs have, to drop it. But that time I was older and wiser, and I took it to someone else at the BBC. My friend Yalda Hakim, who fronts BBC World, she did it instead. And it ran like, #1 on the BBC website for days because he spoke about Meghan Markle. So, early in my career, I sulked and capitulated. Later in my career, I sulked, but I didn't capitulate. And I suppose that's the lesson I learned over those 10 years.
Did that come with experience, that ability to say, actually, you know what, I believe in what I'm telling you. I believe in the product I'm offering you. You need to hear me.
It does come with experience, but unfortunately, even with the most experience in the world, sometimes people aren't just willing to listen or be receptive. And that line I had to tread was between doing what I needed to do and making sure I fought the right battles, because there were many times I did lose, but I knew this one, I was going to die in a ditch for it. And it makes you enemies, you're being a pain in the bum and it's tricky. It's easier just to capitulate, but I just couldn't. I knew this was going to make global news. And of course, I try not to be smug. I promise I tried really hard not to be smug. But
I told you so.
I didn't. I promise I didn't even send a smug passive aggressive email. I did nothing. But obviously the success that delivered was lovely, but it wasn't really ever mentioned again by my team.
So let's talk about the big one then, Prince Andrew. When did the first contact happen and how did it come about?
This is the most bizarre thing, right? You receive 100 emails a day when you're in my job. And a year before the interview happened, I received a random email from a PR I'd worked with before on something else, offering a puff piece, which as we know is like a sort of a suck up interview about something somebody wants to talk about. We just don't do them. And it happened to be Prince Andrew, pitch at Palace, his former entrepreneurial enterprise. And they offered us that. I didn't even tell anybody. I just declined off the bat. I said, unless he'll speak about news issues in a non-puff piece, I'm afraid Newsnight doesn't do that. And then I wrote at the end, the sentence I always wrote, but never, ever really ever heard back on. Do get in touch if anything changes. Well, miracle of miracles, lo and behold, months later, I think it was in April of the next year, I get an email back. Oh, hey, Sam, it's, so-and-so. We've spoken with the Palace and they are interested in doing a more wide-ranging interview. Would you be interested in coming to Buckingham Palace next week to meet Amanda Thirsk, his chief of staff? Well, is the Pope a Catholic? Of course I'm interested. But even at that stage, I don't think I even told my boss because we'd never had a member of the royal family on Newsnight. You'd be insane to be a member of the royal family and come on Newsnight. And at that stage, although the allegations against Jeffrey Epstein were in the ether, they weren't like the big deal, the news story in town, but that was still kind of like in the background. So I went to Buckingham Palace with nil expectations other than an incredible experience. And I took it kind of, without any nerves, researched Amanda Thirsk, turned up as I always do, full of research and information, and checked what Prince Andrew had last said and what he was working on and all that jazz, and walked into Buckingham Palace to meet her for the first time.
And as you say, you were pretty relaxed about it when you went into that meeting because your expectations, you'd set the bar relatively low in terms of what was going to come of this. At one moment in the book that made me laugh was that you managed to take a sneaky selfie of the boots that Janelle mentioned, the famous boots that anyone who's seen Sam on television or met her will know, the boots are Sam's trademark, on the Buckingham Palace carpet. Is that right?
Well, Sarah, I know you're a very classy person, but I have to say, if you were left alone, come on, be honest, if you're left alone in the Queen's waiting room with your phone and nobody's there with you, and there happens to be a picture of the Queen in what looked like an IKEA frame, not going to lie, next to you, and you could have a cheeky selfie in the Queen's waiting room, are you too classy? Be honest.
Oh, no, I don't think I am too classy. I want it to show my kids and my grandkids.
I showed my mum, exactly. I wanted to show my mum and I wanted to show my kid. They've never become public, of course, but that was a very human moment for me. I took a picture of the floor to begin with and those famous boots, and then I worked my way up. And by the end, I was doing very, very crass Instagram-y selfies in the mirror in the Queen's waiting room until the PRs arrived, threw it in the bag, pretend it never happened.
And so then you're taken through the palace and you walk into the meeting. Who's there at that point?
The two PRs were there and they were terribly lovely, but I didn't really remember that they were there in one sense because they were obviously after introductions basically silent, and it was just Amanda Thirsk. and I'd researched her beforehand. I knew we had a lot of commonalities because negotiation and obviously presentation, the job you do too, Sarah, as we know, it's all about actually humanity. So the core of who she was as a human was important to me in my research. And we had quite a lot in common. So probably about 10 years apart, I would imagine. She was bringing up children on her own for different reasons. She was working, you know, in a situation in which she was doing very high profile work that was high peril, as was I. And she was also ex-city. I was ex-law. We had a similar education. And so I went in there with the self that I chose to negotiate with that day, which was not cheesy, sort of like laughter self, which you're used to, you lucky thing. It was very serious, you know, ex-criminal barrister self. And that's what I presented that day because she was a serious woman.
And as you've described, diligent in your research at every stage to make sure that you were fully armed and ready for that meeting. At this stage, though, it looked like it wasn't going to go ahead. Actually, you ended up having to decline the interview and you saw it elsewhere.
That's right. I declined because we got to the end of the negotiation. It was 2 hours. And there, you see, here's the crux of it. This feels like a failure in the moment, right? Because I've spent 2 hours, I've negotiated everything on the table. I've got them to agree that he will talk about Brexit. Remember that? That used to be a thing. The future of the monarchy, Meghan and Harry, baby Archie, race and the monarchy, you name it. But there was a red line that Amanda put at the last second, which was, oh, it's an old story, this Epstein thing. You can't ask about that. And I knew that that was that. So went back to the office. Of course, my editor said no. So the excitement levels had been high. And then, of course, disappointment came. But us saying no and the 2 hours I spent in Amanda's company, just the two of us for that period of time, were, of course, the foundation for everything that followed.
Yes, so that interview then appeared, I think, on ITV.
I think so.
And then after that, what happened next? How did we end up at the next phase of this?
Well, it's a bit like trying to catch a mouse. I mean, I have cats and I don't know if you do, but it is literally like that. The problem of my job is that you have to really be on that fine line between being professional and an absolute pain in the bum, right? So every time the story moved, every time something developed, I get back in touch with Amanda and I say, this story has moved, he's in an invidious position, you know, he really needs to speak out, the country is wondering what his position is, you know, every time a slightly different nuance according to how the story has moved, and every time requesting a meeting, calls, WhatsApps, messages for months and months and months. And then finally, in October, I get an email back from Amanda. Every other time it's a polite decline. And suddenly, okay, Sam, come in. How about next week? And in that moment, you're like, you know, you read it 2 or 3 times, you gasp. And so I did something very unusual that time. I always negotiated alone. I like negotiating alone because then I can be my true self and be a bit, you know, it takes risks that you can't take in front of colleagues. But I asked Emily to come with me because I knew she was a huge asset. I'd always pitched that it had to be a woman, that it needed to be Emily. She was our lead presenter, of course. And I asked her to come with me. And so we met in that same waiting room, that time in October, the two of us to meet Amanda Thirsk again.
And you realised during that meeting, I think, Sam, that there was going to be an interview. It was just about with whom they did it. Why do you think you managed to convince them that you and Emily were the right fit?
I think at that stage, they still weren't convinced, because we had a last meeting, which was only a week before, less than a week before the interview happened. But in that meeting, I think what we did do is we set out my prime thrust of my argument always was, if you are going to do an interview, and she indicated at the end of the conversation that they were looking to do something, you have to do it, number one, with a woman. Secondly, you have to have that kite mark of caliber. If he did a soft interview with one of his buddies, forgive me, a male buddy, you know, the usual suspects, and the two of them look jolly together and it looks like they're going for a drink afterwards, not Prince Andrew, I gather he doesn't drink. Something like that, you may as well do nothing. So I was playing a high stakes negotiation. I said, do us or do nothing, because the nation is not going to be fooled by you doing a chummy interview with some bloke for 2 minutes where you tag on an apology at the end. The nation is not going to find that in any way compelling. If you want to give a plausible account of yourself, you have to do it with someone high caliber, and the high caliber option is Newsnight, terrifying, and Emily, formidable. And that, I feel, was the thrust of the conversation that Emily and I were placing in front of Amanda on that occasion, which I feel was, a compelling narrative to take to the Prince.
How long then was there between that meeting and your subsequent meeting with Prince Andrew himself?
It was 2 or 3 weeks. So a long time in politics, particularly now, and a very long time in interview producer journalism. So we knew we had a hope. I didn't know who we were competing against. I never ask because it's irrelevant and I think it makes you look weak. So I never even asked. But we knew they were obviously seeing other people. They were dating outside, and we had to just wait and see. So I didn't feel we could have done more, and we just had to see whether they were willing to meet us again.
They were. So tell us about that meeting, because there was an unexpected guest in the meeting.
It was just the most bizarre thing, because on that occasion we took the deputy editor, now editor, Stuart McLean. He was also coming along. He ended up being the exec, Emily. And there were going to be 2 people for the Prince. It was going to be Prince Andrew himself. I mean, that is kind of bonkers, because usually I negotiate with the second in command. This was the only time I negotiated, other than with Sir Philip Green, actually, who does his negotiations personally. Only time I've negotiated face-to-face with the actual person. And it's Prince Andrew, to talk about allegations of sexual impropriety, putting it mildly, and his friendship with a paedophile. I mean, it's high stakes. And when we arrive, I'm waiting to meet a lawyer, Sarah. I mean, where is the lawyer? So we arrive and Prince Andrew comes around the corner. I do this curtsy. I might mess up, the mode of address. I think I'm calling Your Royal Highness instead of His Royal Highness. Anyway, everything that could go wrong. And he comes around exuberant, excited to see us, in a very good mood. And he goes, I hope you don't mind. I've brought someone with me. It's a lawyer, right? It's going to be a head of comms. It's going to be someone that's going to end this impossible.
Yeah, you're thinking at that point,
that's what
that's it.
That's it. And then around the corner, Princess Beatrice. And the only thing worse than doing that negotiation in front of him was doing it in front of his daughter. I mean, really, that was a curveball of epic proportions, even with all of my experience and all of my backbone and all of my confidence, which is, I'm assuming, writ large. That was really, really discombobulating.
You didn't let it put you off your stride, though, did you, Sam? Because you were pretty outspoken to him in that meeting and set out exactly why he needed to do this.
Well, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And in that negotiation, I wanted to bring together everything that I've learned. The first thing I've learned is that I felt she was the rainmaker. She was the sensible one, that in conversations afterwards, if we could convince her, then she was going to be the one that would make a difference between no and yes. So I made sure I answered all of her questions. But I'm go big or go bold, it's everything. This is all on the line. And the thing that most matters in a negotiation is trust, integrity, and authenticity. If he thinks for 1 second, and it was the same with all of my clients, whatever they were accused of, that I don't have an open mind about him, or that I'm untrustworthy, game over. So I did say a couple of things that perhaps Emily and Stuart wouldn't have been comfortable with. The most famous, I would say, would be when things were going okay-ish and there was definitely a rapport and he was very interested in my legal background. He actually asked me questions like, do you think I should do it? I mean, you can imagine the rapport we've built when you're asking, the gamekeeper whether or not you should do the hunt. And I said to him, look, sir, I'm going to be honest with you because that's my style. And I can feel Emily's sharp intake of breath, poor thing. And Stuart, God knows what his face was like. I couldn't see it, luckily, because it was out of shot. And I said, look, I know 2 things about you. They're breathing in. The room has gone silent. I know Air Miles Andy, and I know Randy Andy. And I can tell you that whatever the country's thinking, that does not speak well to your current predicament. Everything goes silent. I'm about to get sacked. Let's be frank. Nobody's breathing. And then he laughs. And in that laugh, I felt that was the biggest moment, actually, in terms of speaking truth to power, talking to him straight, him feeling challenged and trusted, and creating a bond that allowed him to say the extraordinary things that he said in that negotiation on the Monday that you guys heard on television on the Saturday.
So you'd already had a bit of a heads up of some of the things that were going to come out in the interview. So let's get to that day. You get the green light, and there's a period of about 2 days, is it, between to go ahead and the interview. So what's going on? Emily was so well briefed in that forensic interview. What kind of preparation was going on behind the scenes then?
Well, luckily, we still had one sane adult left in the building, because we were all, delirious. We hadn't, we hadn't slept. We were really out of our minds. Our editor, Esme Wren, made the very good decision early on to not be involved in any part of the negotiation. She didn't come to the final negotiation. She never came to the interview. Imagine you're the editor of Newsnight. You could go to Buckingham Palace to see that interview, and you choose for professional reasons to stay out of it. So she was still completely sane while we were all insane. And she sat with Emily for 2 days, methodically preparing the simple and incredibly effective methodical questions that you saw, because she was, at that stage, the only one left that was really completely coherent. And her being at home, sane and calm, no doubt like dying inside, was really crucial, I think, to Emily feeling secure and safe in being able to do this, the most terrifying, let's be frank, professional interview, because the stakes are so high. It was terrifying for me as a producer, let alone for Emily.
So you are taken on the day, that fateful day, to the South Drawing Room in Buckingham Palace. You're sitting behind the Duke of York, and you are about to witness this interview unfold. What are you feeling at that point?
I was feeling quite faint, I'll be honest, because unlike the Duke of York, I do sweat profusely. It was extremely overwhelming. We'd had a message from the Director General that morning saying it was the most important interview the BBC had done since Princess Diana. Well, great, but high stakes. I'd come on the bus, it was my day off, so I'd had to make arrangements for my son. And there I was, sitting 15 feet behind Prince Andrew. I never saw his face until you did. I sat behind and watched his mannerisms and his body. And I just felt, it just felt surreal. I still can't really believe it happened, even though I was there the whole way through when the cameras started rolling and he started speaking. And oh my God, unlike usually where somebody says stuff on a briefing call or a negotiation and then it's like it never happened and they do like a 1 out of 10 in comparison to a 10 out of 10, he said all those things that he had said in that negotiation privately, publicly, to you all. And that was what I was most incredulous about, because surely that was just a negotiation conversation. When he said it on camera, it really was beyond belief.
And how do you sit there and maintain a kind of passive poker face, Sam, when you're hearing that going out on television?
I think that's the joy of the background. I mean, obviously, as a criminal defense barrister, you would hear some very creative tales about the reasons that people were in trouble. And obviously, let's put it that way generously, this was a creative tale in terms of the things that he was giving as explanations. I'd been 3 feet from him when he'd given them the first time, and I poker faced it. So in a sense, it was easier in the room on the day, but the problem was that I wasn't involved in the conversation. That was Emily and him. So the intensity of that just keeps your concentration. You know, Sarah, what it's like. But as the producer, listening to it and not eye rolling, looking at the floor, not making eye contact with anybody, making sure I just keep myself calm, not coughing, God forbid, or falling over or dropping something. It was a concentration of 45 minutes to make sure that I didn't accidentally scoff or something like that, because it was unbelievable content.
And you get to the end of the interview. What's the atmosphere like in the room? You're thinking, this is TV gold that we have here. I can't believe that he has said these things and that we have this interview. And what about those around him?
Well, that was so interesting. I have this real problem in terms of having been a lawyer and a journalist, slightly tongue-in-cheek, is that I can't be insincere. It's been a real bane of my career. And so I turned to the delightful equerry, apparently a kind of royal executive assistant next to me, who's been charming and delightful to me. She offered me a martini when I arrived, which I declined, to be clear. And I don't really know what to say. So I say, how do you think it went? Slightly high-pitched voice. And she replies, wasn't he wonderful? And I reply in all sincerity, yes, he was. And as I lift my eyes, I see the schism between the journalists in the room, ex-criminal defense barrister too, I knew he'd got himself in a world of legal trouble, who all know this has been an absolute disaster, and Prince Andrew, who looks pleased as punch.
So pleased that he offered Emily Maitlis a tour of Buckingham Palace.
Well, he offered us all a tour, but I have to be honest. I mean, as you know, it's your job to do that tour. It was not my job to do it. And I feared that having had that rapport with him, he would ask me on that tour, how did I think it went? And I would have been in an impossible position because I wouldn't have known what to say. So I declined and got myself ready to leave the palace with my colleagues, Jake Morris and Stuart McLean, with, you know, the interview of the year at the very least, and just hoping that we didn't drop it or damage it or mess it up. It was an overwhelming feeling, and I just wanted to get out of Dodge.
And then waiting for that interview to go to air on the Saturday night must have felt like an eternity, waiting potentially for the call from the palace to say, we've changed our minds. Where did you watch it? What was it like?
Well, it was the first time I'd seen his face, right? Because I hadn't been in the edit. So I sat behind him that entire time, but I was with my boyfriend and I was at his place, and he has like one of those posh screens, and he has a picture of me standing, as I did for the entire 45 minutes, in front of the screen with my jaw on the floor, because I had only seen the back of his head. And the mannerisms, as you saw that day, was so extraordinary, combined with what I already knew. And I told him it was explosive, and I don't do drama, but, you know, neither of us could believe. So I was basically just kind of yelping vaguely at the screen, even though I knew what he was going to say, because it was brought to the nation, brought to the world. And that obviously was an extraordinary moment to see that and know that we had made it to air. What an achievement, given, you know, what was in that interview.
And then the fallout began, and it was days later when the Duke of York announced he was stepping back from public life. What was that like for you, knowing that this interview that you had negotiated, that you had got to air, had triggered this whole sequence of events that were having constitutional issues, potentially rocking the monarchy?
It's just so bizarre, right? Because obviously, you know, on a sort of personal level, it was an extraordinary experience, but for the country too, it was, we never use this word correctly, but I'm gonna use it. It was unprecedented.
Mm-hmm.
A member of the royal family stepped back from public life because of that interview. And I was at home on my sofa. My son was on the other sofa, as we would do most evenings. I was watching Channel 4 News. There's a plug for the opposition. And on came the screen, oh, we're getting an announcement from the Duke of York. I mean, I dropped my phone. I was aghast, because in that moment, I felt something, Sarah, that I've never felt in my career before. I felt fear, because, you know, I've been minding my own business, negotiating a scoop, the scoop of the year, the scoop of the decade. We'd done it. We'd got it to air. And now suddenly we've toppled a member of the royal family effectively. And I really did feel quite, I know this is not about me in any sense, but it was quite a strange feeling, and I didn't really know what to do or how to respond. So I was just lying there, basically, just sort of watching all the coverage, my phone going mental, trying to recalibrate in my life what this meant, and trying to recalibrate what it meant for the country and obviously for the future of the monarchy.
You also felt a sense of responsibility towards Amanda Thirsk, with whom you said, as you said, you built up some rapport, Sam.
I did. I mean, that's the difference, I think, between the producer relationship and the presenter relationship. Rightly, you know, presenters turn up at the last minute, so there's no impropriety and there's no previous mixing, all that kind of thing. That makes absolute editorial sense. But profoundly, she and I had become interlinked in our worlds. We'd spent a lot of time together, a lot of time conversing. We casually texted one another as well. So, you know, there was a professional friendship there. And we all know when push comes to shove and things like this happened, it's not the person that's going to take the fall. Of course, he's taken a huge toll, but the second this happened, I knew her job was gone. And so I did feel, guilt is the wrong word. She wouldn't want me to use that word because she's very adult, but I did feel obviously uneasy that the decision that she had been part of, and we don't know to what extent it was a little bit her and all him or how it worked, but, you know, that was career ending for her, and, you know, an auspicious career to that point.
And for you, a life-changing moment, Sam, that ultimately has led you here and led to you leaving the BBC after that decade-long career there to do your own thing. What is life like on the other side?
Oh, isn't it amazing? I've developed new habits, which I'm sure freelancers will laugh at. The habit includes looking at the banking app about every 10 minutes. I've no idea what
I've been paid yet.
Is there an invoice? Is there an invoice? Where is the invoice? And also, you know, in theory, I left to do less, but obviously you'll all laugh who are freelancers. You know, it's like when someone says they're going on maternity leave and they say, oh, I'm going to have a rest. And you like, oh my God. But the freedom is fantastic because understandably, the BBC has restrictions on members of staff in terms of what they can do. I feel they are more onerous on producers than they are on presenters and correspondents, to be frank. But it was made clear to me that if I wanted to write a book, even though that would be something that lots of other people would have done in the organisation, it wasn't going to happen for me. So I took a risk on me, and here we are.
And you have done a huge amount, as Janelle touched on at the beginning, Sam, to put producers on the map, the unsung heroes, and to say, look at the people behind this, credit where credit is due.
I do feel very strongly about it. And when I left the BBC, I did a speech I was lucky enough to win a Women in Film and Television Award with Emily jointly. And I got to speak for the first time. And you can tell I like speaking. So it was very hard to go to all those award ceremonies and have to be mute and stand behind. It doesn't really suit my personality. And I just don't think it's fair, to be honest. I think that when there is something that's happened, people who are not just front of camera should get credit. We can all share credit. It doesn't have to detract from one person to give it to the other. It makes you look good if you talk about people on your team who've worked hard. I don't mean Emily, I just mean in general. And at that award ceremony, I did a little impassioned speech and I ended it with the words, "This is for producers everywhere," because too often we are forgotten and credit is not given. And I want to do my little bit. One of my friends calls me the producer's vigilante now that I'm free. And I, call people out all over the place, all over Twitter. I'm an absolute pain in the bum. And, what are they going to do about it? Who booked it? Put out your famous interviewee. Great. Get all of your coverage and all of the things that does for your career. Fantastic. But include who actually negotiated it, because their hard work could be a year or 2 years long. Just give credit where it's due. Let's get into that good habit. And that's my thing that I've obviously got. I'm trying to change in a tiny little way in the profession to extend it to my world, which was the producer world. And obviously lots of other behind the scenes people who we all talk to one another and we all feel the same thing. So doing my little bit for better or worse.
Brilliant. Well, let's get some questions now from our audience. We've got one from Sylvia here for you, Sam. How do you choose the best next interviewee? Did you used to think a lot about the next story, or was it more reactionary to the news flow?
So I used to run what I would call a triple track. Sorry to give a complex answer, but basically I would always have my A-listers who I were trying for all the time. That could be, Putin. I mean, obviously, luck, Trump, the Pope, Biden, whoever it was. Then you have the reactive news ones. And I chose to only go for what I would call the high value ones, where my expertise was necessary, that you needed extra help and extra ability. And then in the middle, I'd have what I would call my kind of like the ones that I loved, that I was going for, where I would decide, and with my boss's sanction, were the ones that we should be making news with. So the three heads of, their news already, their news today, but they're probably gone tomorrow. And the ones in the middle who are going to get you on the front page of the Daily Mail, because to be frank, that would usually be my test of what I wanted to try and achieve.
The pickup that you get from the interviews.
I used to say, and sounds a bit rude, but I often put the news into Newsnight because I want to make news. I want to get news lines. And so unlike people around me, that was also something that drove me. I want to make sure that our output has impact. I want to get it on the website. I want to make sure it's all over Twitter. I want to make sure the nation is talking about it. And that's really what drove me.
Well, I said I wasn't going to ask any more questions, but I have got one on that point that I have to come in there with, Sam, which is, how do you make news lines? Because it's not just about the person and the title. How do you ensure that interview does generate news lines? What's the relationship between you and the presenter, the briefing that goes on?
Well, I think that when I started at Newsnight, that was effectively the producer's job in a sense, because obviously, the presenter has a magic and capability to them, but they're lost in 10 or 15 things to do. you only have one thing to do on that particular day in terms of one section, and it would be your responsibility to come up with, you know, the killer question effectively. So I was trained in an environment where Robbie Gibb was my deputy editor, Simon Enright, who lastly worked with Prince Charles, was the other deputy, and we were taught, what is the killer question? And that didn't really become so much of a thing later in my career, but that was what I'd been taught. Now, sometimes the killer question is a damp squib, it backfires and it goes nowhere. But my motivation for every interview, every briefing with the presenter would be, what is going to get me, us, you, me, a newsline? And how can we make sure that the presenter says that? Sometimes they'd be happy to, sometimes you'd have to have a bit of aggro about it, but I didn't really ever get it wrong. I don't mean to be full of myself. I just had a good instinct for it. And the more I got it right, the more they listened. So you have to get, if you like, credit to make sure that people will like take you seriously, unfortunately.
Hilly has asked, who are the ones that got away, the people you'd most like to have booked but wouldn't play the game?
Well, I had a very long game with Sir Philip Green, who I know is very difficult with some journalists, but was always very nice to me. But he rang me actually the day after Andrew happened. I took 2 phone calls, one from my mum and one from Sir Philip Green. And he said to me, Sam, my wife said that I should do this interview, and I told her no. And I want to thank you. And I'm like, okay, Sir Philip, why? And he said, because we were watching this interview last night. I turned to her and I said, I bet you that's Sam McAlister. And my wife said something to me that she's never said before, Sam. I'm like, what's that, Sir Philip? She said I was right. And so, you know, he would have been absolute TV gold because he doesn't play by the rules. And whatever the allegations are, you know, in a Newsnight studio, quite a traditional setting, he would have set the floor alight. And I would have loved to see that interview, but I didn't convince him.
Louise asks, what is the one quality, Sam, in your mind that takes you from being an okay producer to a brilliant producer?
I would say decency. It's very easy in the industry to get caught up in competition, backstabbing, nastiness, competitiveness, all of that. But the thing that's got me through, I used to always say excellence is its own reward. And then there was a point at which it wasn't. But you know, the integrity and the decency that I had, I created genuine relationships with people. I was trusted. I stood by my word, even when it was to my detriment. I was kind, polite. I wasn't rude. I was never a pain in the bum. I tried to be patient and decent. And when things went wrong, I tried not to be cruel or difficult. So I would say the difference between a normal producer just going about their business and trying to do the bare minimum to stay alive and stay sane, and something different is going the extra mile and just actually seeing yourself as a product and making sure that that product is somebody that people want to work with.
And that kind of leads into Rachel's question, which is, what is your best advice for securing a big interview? Contact their PRs and keep persisting, or is there a better way to get in touch with them?
I always go for 3 ways. So PR is the basic one where you have to start right. You know, you have to go that route, their agent, their PR, the person who basically probably is never going to tell them that you made the bid. Then you're trying to find a way to get to them directly, which often doesn't work at all. But, you know, they might be, if they're a CEO or something, they might be on LinkedIn. You might have friends in common, so you can just message them directly. And then second of all, the last person you're trying to get in touch with is the person who actually makes the decision. Because most of the time, the PR that you're dealing with or the junior agent or whoever it is not the decision maker. So trying to find around your networks from people who work with the area of news that you're pursuing, trying to find out who the actual power maker is really the key, because you spend hours and hours talking to the wrong person, it's going to make no difference to the outcome.
Sometimes do you feel that if you get as close directly to them as possible, that you're not being blocked by the gatekeepers, that you've got a better chance once you've got that foot in the door? You 100%. Can start to convince them. But if you can't get past the gatekeepers, you're going to keep getting knocked back.
That's right. Well, that's why you have to keep trying with the gatekeepers, because sometimes the gatekeeper changes their mind. I mean, I spent 2 years pursuing Mel Gregg, who was the Royal Hoax DJ, who did that terrible call that ended in the death of Jacintha, the nurse who committed suicide after putting the call through to the Duchess of Cambridge. I'm sure you covered it, Sarah. And
yeah, when she was in hospital while she was pregnant.
That's right, when she was very sick, and they did a joke call, and it would have been funny until the terrible tragedy that she killed herself. I spent 2 years pursuing that interview. And she finally gave us her first UK, but it was with her agent. And then latterly I tried to find her and get her, but I never, ever found her. But 2 years of conversations with that agent, and one day they changed their mind, and there I was with that global exclusive. So keeping going with the original person, because they might be able to change their mind, or they are the decision maker at some juncture, but always trying for a behind the back that isn't going to offend the gatekeeper, being careful how you play it so you don't look like a rude jerk, is really the balance that you're running. But ultimately, I'd rather take a risk and try and get to the right person.
The Mel Gregg interview was a really fascinating one, Sam, wasn't it? Because of the difference in outcomes for the two of those involved in that hoax call, Mel and her male co-host. She lost her job, lost everything, a very different outcome for him. Why do you think that was? Is there gender at play in some of the ways in which people are treated, reacted to in the media?
I mean, I really do think there is. You know, I'm never looking for a sort of like a simple gendered answer, because I like to try not to believe it's always about that. But I think in this circumstance, it was really a parting of the ways. I mean, she chose to leave after it happened. He stayed. He got told off, obviously, but then he became kind of like disc jockey of the year or something.
Yeah, he won an award,
He won all these awards, and she could not get a job. Now, obviously, there also plays into that the fact that she was, you know, frankly, very photogenic. Pictures of her were all around the world. If you do remember the story, all you'll remember is the pictures of her crying, or bullets in the post, the conversation she had with us. I think his name was Michael. I wrote a book and I researched him. Can't even remember his name, you know. And I think, unfortunately, the glare, she did a very tearful apology on air, which created more coverage, just led to vitriolic hatred centered on her for years and years and years.
This is a question from Louise.
Whatever it is, I like it.
Yeah, I like it. It's made me laugh. What would you do if you bumped into Prince Andrew one day, today, in Pizza Express, maybe, or Princess Beatrice? What would you say?
I tell you the funniest thing. So basically, I was hated by Pizza Express after this happened, because obviously, I don't know whether you saw, but they did all this social media. It was like, you go away for half an hour and then blah, blah, blah. And they weren't very responsive to my sort of, you know, cheeky apologetic tweets. But they finally invited me to something on Friday. They've invited me to an event, and, you know, maybe they've invited those two as well. So, you know, I'll let you guys know. In truth, as you can tell, I'm pretty confident and brazen. I've done nothing wrong. So if I were to meet with him, I would wish him a good evening, and I would say, nice to see you. And I would walk off with my head held high, because if anyone's done something wrong around here, it certainly isn't me.
A question from Rebecca for you. Do you think there was misplaced trust from the Prince, that the BBC was on his side?
No, absolutely not. I really do think that he understood what he was doing. We made it very clear that, you know, there was no side to be on. Perhaps other people are quite deferential to royal family members, but, you know, Emily had never done a royal interview. I'd never been at the palace. You know, it was clear very early on that we were not kind of like looking to do something that was going to be deferential. And I think that he liked the idea of basically, you know, being in front of someone as extraordinary and brilliant as Emily, and really kind of, you know, having his moment to, he believed, vindicate himself. But there, absolutely not did I think he thought he was going to get a soft ride.
We've got a question from Laura here. Are you able to shed any light on today's headlines about the photo that could rock the monarchy?
Yeah, I think that came out, wasn't it, on Saturday? I think I first saw that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have to be honest, I didn't have anything to do with the photographer on that day. The photographer was the person that's given this line to the Mail. But the only thing I can tell you about, because it's kind of a matter for him and for the BBC, because they own the photo, he says, I believe, is that the front page of my book is one of his photos. An uncontentious one. I am sad.
I've got it here. Here we are.
That's it's Mark Harris's photo. So that's the chair before the royal bums appeared. So he was there on the day. He was there for several hours, and who knows what it was that he is talking about. But I'm afraid not a matter for me.
Emily says, I still don't understand why Prince Andrew and his team agreed to the interview, and how they even thought it had gone well before it aired. what were their expectations for the interview? I mean, I think you sort of touched on that. You were pretty clear that this was a no holds barred interview.
Yeah, I think he was a bomb waiting to go off. And, you know, he's a man who's never been told he's rubbish or been sacked or demoted or sidelined. So he has what I now call the royal delusion. I don't mean that rudely, but just factually, that environment creates a delusion about your capabilities. And here's the rub, Sarah, and, you know, to answer this question, nobody thinks they're going to do a terrible interview. Even people who are rubbish at interviews still think they're going to do good ones. So I think he thought this was his opportunity to vindicate himself, to return to public life. He'd tell us all what happened, and then he'd be able to go, fine, you know, that's sorted, back to real life. So we may think that sounds insane, but clearly that felt to me like that was the motivation that he had.
You know, to use a legal phrase, when you look at precedent, though, when you look back in history at interviews that members of the royal family have given, these big sit-down interviews, they are rarely without some big controversy.
Well, that's the risk, isn't it? I mean, I said to him in the negotiation that obviously things had changed. You said, you know, innocent till proven guilty. Well, kind of. When I was a barrister, it used to be that if you didn't give evidence on your own behalf, the jury were instructed you cannot draw any adverse inferences from the defendant not speaking. Well, they changed that, because we talked about that in the negotiation. And I said, I believe the country has changed its view on that too. Silence is not an explanation. And so I do think that he felt that he had to say something, and it was just a matter of with who, and we were the right people in the right place at the right time. And obviously he was looking for a very different outcome from the one that his own answers caused.
Alison has asked, have you ever backed out of a potential interview? And if so, why?
I think we've had a couple of times where we backed out. I can't remember the names of the people, but there were certainly cases where we had made it clear that there weren't going to be conditions, and then suddenly there were, or they wanted ridiculous things that public service broadcasters can't provide, like £2,000 for, you know, their makeup. Or they ask for huge sums of money. I once had Martin Bashir, for example, when he didn't work at the BBC, asked me for £5,000. So I declined that for his time, and I offered him 12 curly whirlies instead, which he took. True story.
He accepted the curly whirlies.
I said, what are you missing? That's all I had. He was in America. I said, what do you miss? Is it digestives? Is it tea? He said, curly whirlies. I said, I tell you what, Martin, you can pee off with your £5,000, but I'll send you a dozen curly whirlies. Deal? And the deal was done.
£5,000 down to curly whirlies. I want you on my negotiating team. Sam, what about the interviews that you perhaps haven't been as comfortable with? You talk about one of the worst you felt you'd ever overseen. Was that with Amy Schumer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to sound rude towards Amy Schumer, who's no doubt absolutely brilliant at what she does, but it's that very strange relationship now between celebrity and news. I'm sure you struggle with it too, Sarah, in the modern age, you know, every poor celebrity, if you're on a news program, they're going to be asked about geopolitics. You know, it's not really the best place for them to be giving commentary, but in order to get them on your program and to enjoy the headlines, you bring them in, and mutually they agree to answer a couple of questions about the president or, you know, geopolitics or economics. It's always very uncomfortable. And on that particular occasion, her discomfort was writ large, as was Emily's discomfort of having to talk about, you know, masturbation and bad sex. It just didn't gel, and it just didn't work for either party. I'm sure she didn't enjoy it either.
And Sam, one of the details in the book that I like particularly was that when you're sitting listening to an interview being recorded, you have your two highlighters color-coded for things that are definitely in, things that are maybes. There wasn't a lot of highlighting going on during that interview.
I was waiting with the highlighter, just please God. And the complicating factor with that was that was the interview that my editor at the time, Ian Katz, said he most wanted in the world. So I delivered it. I was feeling a bit smug. I wasn't feeling so smug when I was sitting there waiting, poised with that highlighter. And it was only once actually in the interview that I put the special, you know, pink highlighter, which is certain, when she talked about moving to Mexico, I think it was, if Trump was elected, which she didn't, of course, but it really was just waiting for that bit that when we got back to the office and the editor goes, Sam, what's the best line, that I'd have it in pink in my highlighter, because my brain would go completely blank the second they asked that question.
Sam, we are going to have to wrap up there. Thank you so much. It has been absolutely fascinating hearing from you. I really hope everybody listening has enjoyed it too. Thank you very much to Women in Journalism for bringing us together, putting on this event, and for raising money for Future Dreams as well. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Sam and I are going to be doing a masterclass next week. In fact, 4 interviews. Producers, if you do want a bit more, you can find out on our social media. But a big thank you to everyone. And I'll hand over to Janelle.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Sam, so much. That conversation was as interesting as I thought it would be. And one of my friends, and we're on WhatsApp all the time, said, this is so good. So thank you very, very, very much for all of that insight from the behind the scenes. And as I said, go and follow them on their social medias. And thank you for your donations to Future Dreams House, which deals with women with cancer. And also just want to say that if you have not yet joined Women in Journalism and you are a woman in journalism, we would love you to join us, because we do more events like this. We want to help with skills and with resources and with all the kinds of things that people need, sometimes the gaps that newsrooms just aren't able to fill for us, and of course the networking. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thank you for everything, Sarah. You're the best.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.